So welcome to the psychology seminar of today. We are going to talk about frustration and excuses. Well, it's not really what was on the discussion, of course, towards easier applications and development. So here we are with that panel, and we have quite a spectrum and hopefully also, I would say, diverging views, because that is hopefully the most productive thing when we see different options. Would be kind of almost boring if everybody would have the same opinion. Who is on the panel? We will shortly come to that. Quickly, what the panelists were asked is to think about 4 questions. First, let's get clear what NDN application means. So if I go back to the title, towards easier NDN application development. So hopefully we'll see interesting discussions already there. What are the challenges when you develop NDN applications? Also the deployment comes to mind. Number 3, what could be done better in terms of tooling? What is missing? And number 4, the competition. How can you convince developers not yet using NDN, but instead using TCP/IP environments to have a look at NDN and the applications you can write here? So every panelist has prepared 1 slide, and we'll go through these. So you see, from these questions, yes, there must be some frustration. Otherwise, you wouldn't come up with these questions. And I had the excuse title, and I tried to say, no, that's not the panel for excuses. I would like to hear, I will do this, I will support that. Or I was thinking somebody should do, whether I should exclude that. But I think that's also a good thing if we can identify somebody should do that. And if all the panelists agree somebody should do that, I think all should then do it. So that is a little bit the mood I would like to give. I will try to, to give it, yes, let's try it more, something constructive, and let's not argue, oh, this is not working, or this is bad, whatever. So a step forward. That is the goal of that panel. Finally, the panelist. And now I more and more give the voice to the panelists. We have, in alphabetic order this time, Alex, heavily involved in the NDN development, IC and IoT being a focus right now, according to what we got here. We have Jeff Burke, on also CoPI project, PI. I leave it with PI, but also heavily involved and driving a lot from the application space, the discussions and the development. Kathleen, from I take now the network measurement protocol as a technical core of what you're right now looking at, and there's also a paper coming up soon, I think with several of these panelists, and but just explicitly on that topic. Then Davide, also well known in the community, core developer on NDN, and Konstantin, you might have to then explain when you come to your slides, your background, what the DARPA Share VeryNet program is about. That might not be, at least for me, known to everybody here. So these are our 5 panelists, and that is the way I would suggest that we proceed. As said, they have prepared 1 slide, and I was thinking, should we cut in the different questions? That would be bad. Every panelist has 1 view about all these 4 questions, and let each panelist take his or her 1 slide and go through all the points, present the point of view, the frustration, but also maybe the consequences or the suggestions each panelist wants to do, and give each panelist 5 minutes for that 1 slide. I would like then to add a small intermediate thing about panelists quickly discussing what each other has said. Do we agree, violently agree? Do we disagree? Quickly take the temperature on that part. And then maybe it's worth to go systematically through all the 4 questions again and see question by question, what are the burning points? I would then hopefully also have time for the audience to join the discussion. I said it was really last minute that I joined that moderation task or panel, and I have to ask the panelists if they would agree with this. It's not me to really put that on rail. It would be kind of I thought that would be a venue to go. What do you think? This was just kind of intuitive. When I saw your slides, there was kind of a formatting questions, and somehow it made an interesting mix. There is no hidden agenda on that, if that is the question you had in mind. It was just aesthetic or a gut feeling that this might be a good way to proceed.
These are my quick takes, but I'm going to cheat a little bit because I've seen some of the slides from the other panelists, and I thought they did a really great job on challenges and tools, and I think I won't say so much about that because I think there's better stuff coming up. So, and also I got to say some stuff yesterday in my talk. A thing though that this whole idea of what an application is probably something we need to get our hands around. And I'd kind of alluded to that yesterday, that the application shouldn't have to, know about faces and names unless, there's really a reason for the application to know that. So it was that notion that we want to provide support for applications, but not a straitjacket. And this is one of the things that's different about NDN, is that it's letting you expose things that you want to expose, but hide things that you need to hide. I mean, I think right now we're way on the side of not hiding anything or providing any support. But I also was thinking about this morning in the stuff about the ICN1 thing. And I hate to disagree with Eve, who's somebody I like and respect, but I think having information plane and communication plane is the wrong model, that because in NDN we have to have a lot more of things talking to each other, we need to think about that when we think what is an application and what is it that we want to enable to it. But this thing that comes below it, this bridge or this bespoke transport, it really needs to have interaction and even, maybe feed some things to other layers. So that whole cross-layer idea is where a lot of things are going, and we have the opportunity to do that in NDN. So I don't think that my challenges and tool ideas are any better. In fact, they're probably worse than some of the other people here. But I do want to say about convincing developers that we need to show people, not tell them that NDN is great. We need to keep doing some things, and there've been some really cool things that I've seen in the yesterday and a little bit today that I think are going to help with that. But that's my motto, is show, don't tell. And, my opinion, I guess. So I think NDN needs roots and wings, and the wings are this great applications that show everybody, but we really need to get the roots right. I mean, we need to make sure that we're debugging this stuff on the wire. Does it work the way we think it does? And it's a good philosophy for life, in my opinion. Okay, I'm done.
So to answer this question, so first of all, I may not have a very good perspective on all things because I'm kind of involved very low level in different places. But I try to take kind of external look at what we have, what we're defining. So first about the applications. So there's a kind of NDN applications and applications of NDN. So I'm kind of thinking from the second perspective. So it's not exactly we're writing NDN applications specifically, but we rather need to try to apply in NDN in whatever form or format within some kind of application framework or something else. But again, this is a quite vague definition of what NDN application is and how exactly we're going to be doing this. It's a very good question. I hope Jeff maybe and other panelists will define applications a little bit more. Regarding the challenges, so the first one that came to my mind is naming itself. So that one not necessarily for the kind of mechanical application development, but rather in order to start building NDN environment, NDN applications, you have to consider a lot of things regarding the naming. So every time we start some of the development, we kind of different people start talking from different perspectives, like, oh, we need to optimize forwarding, or we need to optimize the security, but we still need to figure out how to put all the components as part of the application name, or in some parts needs to go outside the name. So there's a lot of kind of unguided so far process how to deal with the naming part. And sometimes I just look at the Konstantin. Have to hide part of the name. But in some places you want to hide and yet want to consider forwarding, aggregation, like a deaggregation. So there are so many things to consider. And kind of the highlight here, we need some form of a guideline. And if I reflect what Kathy put on the slide, we really have limited documentation about that part. And okay, I would agree with another point that she made on the slide, but she didn't explicitly mention limited documentation. I'm coming from the developer side of this approach. I know library, I know NFD, but I also heard quite a bit of frustration that it became too complex and we have too many things, and I don't know what exactly we can do to improve all those stuff. Okay, let me go ahead. Another huge challenge that this is the low-level stuff, things that keep changing in the world. And we're spending way too much time just on the basic stuff, catching up with things. Operating system changes, library changes, everything's broken, and all the code no longer works. And instead of doing new things, we kind of redoing the old stuff. So that was a big challenge. I don't know what maybe others also have similar. Okay, I'll maybe skip this one, and Jeff will talk more. Even though we have some of the automation tools available for some connectivity automation, for security automation, we still need more of this, all of these things. And that's, again, I'm reflecting some other, what Kathy said, and I hope what Jeff and others said, will say is some high-level frameworks, and just even trying to avoid the word API, to deal with the NDN, or build NDN as part of something that developers of the application, or even higher level people who are using applications don't need to deal with, or it's very, very transparent. Okay, I think I'm not a very good person to define missing tools, because for me there's a lot of tools available. I know them. I want to hear more about what other people think what is missing, so we can start adding those missing pieces. I mentioned the tracing, visualizing, debugging the security. I'm kind of coming from the security perspective, and we have, from that perspective, we have really limited tools available, I mean, besides other types of tracing and debugging. And for the convincing of developers, so this one I completely agree with Kathy. And I think something is what I put on the slide is reflecting this. We cannot convince people who already uses TCP/IP or some other IP-based protocol that's successful in their applications. If we only can convince them if something they completely cannot implement, or completely broken, or there is a substantial difference in implementation. So I put kind of a few examples, like something ad hoc in vehicle environments, and ad hoc augmented reality stuff. So something qualitatively different, something that is not possible with IP. Okay, I may have spent more than 5 minutes.
I think it was in time. May I quickly ask back or point out the challenges? If I take the last one, limited high-level API, so it seems to imply we need more of the higher-level APIs, right? So you negate what is here, but if I apply it to the other 3 bullets, that goes wrong, right? Naming, you're not suggesting to drop naming. Evolving environment, you're not suggesting to not evolve the environment. And dealing with security bootstrapping, you're not suggesting that we should drop security. So there might be kind of different levels of frustration or actions out of that. Maybe we can come back to that. Just an observation I made while listening to you talk.
So just starting from applications that we work on and are focused on right now, it's a mix of applications that look at media in new ways and generally are thinking about real-time delivery of individual media elements that are then reassembled based on some sensor data or some type of pre-scripted algorithm that assembles those chunks in some new ways. So a lot of our consideration that I think has been influenced by NDN is how to think about media differently, but we're also in many applications considering sort of simple sensor and control systems as well. The challenges, so we have a team of people, a couple developers and some students in and out of our lab over the last 6 or 7 years that are quite connected to the NDN community and have worked at a pretty low level in implementing libraries and applications. And so we feel pretty equipped to do the more experimental parts of working with NDN, and then where we get stuck in trying in real projects is deployment, is that if we want to manage a network where we have more than a few devices or something complicated is going on, and I'll kind of leave that vague and we can talk about it later, it gets hard to make those networks work. And so that's our sort of key challenge right now. And sometimes the things that are supposed to be really easy conceptually in NDN can be difficult. Things like managing security or having communication through whatever means or is available, many radios, for example. One key sort of challenge too that we find is trying to provide these higher level libraries that others have already alluded to, and what are the ways that we can present NDN ideas without getting to interest data granularity. And I think that's a really interesting and kind of fun research area that we're now able to think about. We're missing some ability to compose different features and say, well, we're going to use network-based or name-based access control and schematized trust and this and that and sync and a few other things. And it's hard right now to really understand how to compose those things together and have that both at an implementation and design level. In terms of tooling, deployment is still really key. It's sort of addressing the challenges are really the key, the tooling needs that I see. I think in looking, so we've spent the last couple months in a crash course of doing applications over AWS and kind of thinking about how we would do those applications in a local or edge supported way using NDN. It really needs to involve storage, compute generally, and maybe search more specifically as first-class citizens in our research and thinking about tooling is that we've done, or collectively the community has done a lot of work in networking, and there's more work to do. But to really start building applications, we need some other basic components, and they're coming, but they're not there yet in terms of the tooling. In terms of security, I hate to say this, but we probably need some examples of graphical interfaces to manage security in NDN just to convince people that it's actually not that hard, that the relationships can be quite clear, that the schematization of trust or access control relationships based on names are logical. Even if you look at the output of some of Alex's command line tools, they already show things in a kind of...
That's why I mentioned.
Right. I mean, they already sort of do that, but I think more examples that don't have to be completely general that help people to understand how security relationships work would be fantastic. As far as convincing developers, I think the idea of looking at greenfields is really important, and I agree with the previous panelists about that. I also think there's a lot of value. There's a lot of fairly crappy middleware frameworks that are out there that people work with that could be replaced easily by NDN if it was a little easier to deploy and had a little bit of some higher level support for things like pub/sub style functionality, and we're maybe missing the chance to put that type of functionality as a sort of Trojan horse into other existing environments and show the mix of LAN and WAN capability there. And I think there are some things that would be really interesting for developers. I won't go through all the other points here. Maybe we can come back to them later, except to mention that I think more impure examples that kind of mix NDN and IP-based stacks, not just layer 3, but IP-based application protocols with NDN, and experiment with just getting data-centric ideas out there and showing that there's a path to a network based on them would be a really interesting way to get more developers engaged.
May I ask back on one point? No one library to rule them all, like Boto 3 on AWS. Boto 3 would be a good example for you?
So it's this last couple months has been informative to try to switch gears and stop thinking in the kind of NDN framework and think in a cloud-driven way. And one of the things for many of the applications, the way we can access and manipulate all of the AWS services in Python is import one library and go look up what the API calls are to do something with it. Make different contexts for different security roles by instantiating different kind of different instances of that library, and open a database, open a messaging, open some other service, and that it's very different really than what NDN offers or claims to offer, but there's something quite interesting about how simple it is to access those services. Doesn't make the concepts easier,
right?
But the implementation
and it's still low level to some extent,
right? And at very low level, but it is. There's really one place to start in experimenting in Python, and that's a very nice thing.
Got the point.
There. Yeah.
Thank you.
Christian, would you allow me to make one more comment? It's kind of related to what Jeff mentioned, but I forgot to put the additional challenge as part of mine. So for deployment to be real deployment and for existing application or existing systems, it's really hard to deal with the existing operating systems, existing frameworks, because all of them are focusing on either point-to-point model directly or indirectly, assuming something about the point-to-point, assuming something about IP. So it's really, really frustrating sometimes that you want to have multicast communication, the interface naturally is multicast, and yet you're facing the impossible challenge that you have to do it point-to-point fashion. Or you don't even have ability to deploy NDN stack, like for example on this magical device. There is no way we can install NFD because it's a closed platform. And that's what I kind of reason going to the green fields is more fruitful, because they not necessarily have these frustrating concerns.
Okay, so we continue with Davide.
So I took the first question pretty literally. So I started to think about what do we want to focus. What do we want to talk about in this panel? And I think we should restrict ourselves to applications, in the sense that the applications are what I call top level. If you see the software as a stack, it's the top level part of the stack that most users will deal with, will have to use. And this kind of software is usually built for a specific purpose. So in other words, I'm excluding from the discussion, from the how do we make NDN applications development easier, I'm excluding the lower level libraries, the utilities, the utility tools, the development tools, debugging tools that are supposed to help developers make the help the developers make writing applications easier. So essentially, the few low-level developers should suffer for the benefit of the many application developers. I think this is true also in IP, in all IP-based network stacks. It should be no different with NDN. So we should make the lower level stack easier to use for the application developers. A few examples of applications that I've seen in NDN space: mobile applications, Android specifically, because of what Alex said, we can't do this on iOS. Maybe in the future we will. IoT, a lot of IoT, audio, video streaming, more recently AR, VR, then data-intensive applications, big data, especially in the scientific community. And then finally something that I summarized with the term challenged networks. This could mean disaster scenarios, DTNs, all network environments where connectivity is intermittent. You have lots of packet loss, lots of mobility, vehicular networks too, and so on. What about the challenges? I don't know where to start, honestly. I'll just mention maybe two things. First thing is the security. I do agree with Jeff and Alex that maybe it's not that hard, but we're making it harder than it has to. There are implementation problems, and the implementation is extremely fragile. You do like something wrong and everything breaks, and it breaks in hard to debug ways. So at the end of the day, most users end up disabling security, and most developers end up ignoring it. So not supporting proper security in their applications. This is not what we want. The second thing is deployment, has been mentioned already, and all sorts of issues in deployment from platforms that keep changing. Not our problem, but it requires manpower. There are issues that require manpower to be addressed. And this manpower is taken away from more interesting development. But there's prefix propagation. I saw that it's somewhat complicated. Again, similar to the security problem, it's fragile, it can break, it's almost impossible to debug. If you're trying to register a prefix on a testbed and it doesn't work, there's essentially no way to know what went wrong. And the auto configuration, again, for simplicity of deployment. I was tricked into believe that you open your laptop, your NDN-enabled laptop, and you send an interest wherever you are, and everything works. Yeah, good luck. I'm going to add. So all of this essentially I can summarize with this expression, "death by 1,000 cuts." I think it summarizes the problem. There is no huge problem, single big problem, but the sum of many small problems essentially makes deployment and just using NDN, or writing NDN and using NDN apps very hard for the regular everyday user. So for missing tools, again, like Alex, as I'm involved in NDN development, I know how to move through the code. So I haven't mentioned documentation here, not because it's fine, it's just because it's not my primary problem, but it is a huge problem for other developers, for application developers. I do mention though network monitoring and network debugging in general, visualizing the problems in the network, what's not working, and possibly the higher level than, this packet is going from, this interest is going from this node to this other node. You don't get the full picture from that. So while tools like TCP dump are useful, or NDN version of TCP dump are useful, we need something higher level that gives you the full picture. Okay. Finally, how do we convince TCP IP developers? Well, this is a hard question, and I have two different answers. First of all, I don't think that there are many TCP IP developers today. Not many developers use TCP directly, or UDP for that matter. There are so many layers on top of TCP today that literally nobody is using TCP, except those developers that write in middleware or other libraries on top of it. So developers today use HTTP, they use REST, they use PubSub, they use MQTT. They're not dealing with TCP directly, so they should not deal with interest and data directly, I assume. So our libraries are too low level. We need to build higher level libraries, an NDN version of 0MQ, an NDN version of the gRPC. The second part of the answer is maybe this is still not enough, and maybe I partially agree with Alex that there's no way to convince them. We should just try instead to solve the problems that are hard, very hard, impossible for IP to solve, and then provide easy or relatively easy solution for those, and hope that we can sneak in NDN through that door. Thank you.
Okay. If it's okay, I just would like to continue to keep in the timetable. Konstantin, would you please?
Okay, so first of all, to introduce myself, probably like a few of you know me. Konstantin Serban from Perspecta Labs. The question you had before, what is SHARE program? That's a DARPA program, secure handhelds at the tactical edge with reliable communication somewhere in there. So that's a DARPA program. We are one of the performers together with 26 Labs, Chris Foster over there, other performer. Basically, all the slides and my NDN exposure comes from via the SHARE program. So that's mostly focused on wireless at the tactical edge, and deals with those kind of problems on Androids, and so that's the slant of my view. So take it with sort of like from that perspective. There are lots of sort of like aspects that I would like to talk about in terms of NDN. What applications? Like I'm exposed to situational awareness application, emergency response applications, in general applications where all the communication is group communication, not like obviously one-to-one communication, sharing of the information. That's ATAC was one of the applications that we had to handle on, like distributed chat and so on. There are lots of application like content distribution, as we know, where you have like static content that needs to be distributed or semi-dynamic content. And mostly protocols in support of the above type of application. So basically, streaming, point to multi-point streaming, and so on. In terms of development chat.
So, so I hear a lot of stuff about the difficulty of maintaining the code, and I know myself too, it's hard to dig through it. And a couple of kind of suggestions I have on that. One is that maybe projects or pieces of things that got worked on and nobody's ever going to come back to it, those need to be deprecated somehow. If there were some way of it being clear what things still have work going on them, so as somebody coming in, you kind of know where to focus and what to ignore, because you can go in and say, oh, well, here's an application model, but it isn't really up to date and nobody's maintaining it. So I think that would be helpful. Can I
try to steer a little bit? I mean, you already jumped to conclusions or suggestions.
Yeah.
If I take just a case, would everybody agree that there is too much things around, that you get lost in what has been contributed to NDN? So let's just see if everybody agrees that this is a pain point. Or others might say, no, we need even richer contribution landscape.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about things that are dead.
Right.
Like that if you tried to use it, it doesn't work with the current NFD. So, yes. Or things haven't been kept up to date. So I was just sort of thinking of a dead project list, or things should be moved. So,
I agree. I agree. That there are both too many things and not enough things. As we said, lack of high-level APIs. So not enough things, but there are too many things that were done maybe years ago, maybe even last month, but they're considered superseded by something else. That it should be clear that this is not the right way to do it. Don't try. And some projects are just left around. They're just there, and someone stumbles upon them and doesn't know that they're not supposed to do things that way. And they try, and they waste their time, and they get frustrated.
Okay, so it's... please.
I think with this, partially we're already trying to do this deprecation. So there are some projects on a GitHub that clearly, we had this discussion during the NDN platform calls, and we marked many projects to be deprecated, and yet people still using something that was developed 4 years ago, and then asking questions, oh, why VNDN doesn't work with the... That was a question I got literally last week.
Wow. CCNB.
Oh, CCNB, that's another one. But another one that is related to the code development. So a lot of things is with NDN, at least right now, is happening by students. They come and go, and we had some funding as part of the CRI to support kind of ongoing development. I'm looking to a specific person. So right now we kind of have really limited amount of resources available on a consistent fashion to actually support various operations. So, for example, I don't know what they're planning to bring during the panel or some point later. No. So we have a number of libraries. So we have one kind of library that's been supported by the kind of developers of NFD and all this, some of the related code bases. But there is also multiple libraries like NDN.js, JNDN, PyNDN that they extremely, used a lot by the application developers that trying to play with the NDN in some fashion. They may not know have the application developers, they probably don't have a expertise into supporting that library, because they're not C++ hardcore developers, they're just kind of Python, JavaScript stuff. And that's a kind of current challenge of how we keep making those things better in kind of synchronizing with the platform development, synchronizing with the OS development.
So it is part of the second questions, the development challenges, right? So getting developers aligned, managing the existing contribution somehow, the governance of that might be lacking. Is that all related? We started with that there's too much things around. And
too much on you. It was more, it's not that there's too much. I think it's more what Davide said there's both too much and too little. It's just that stuff that's dead, and which is understandable. As Alex said, a lot of it's student stuff. I think there needs to be some sort of clear way to say this is no longer being maintained, and maybe move it somewhere else. If somebody wants to pick it up for some reason, then they're doing it with, full mode.
I still, very small comment.
Yes.
I don't think we have too much. We don't have enough. And I would phrase it as a development challenge. So I think we're doing a good job adding new stuff, like developing new stuff. We have bad problem with maintenance. So the maintenance challenge is huge.
Well, a related problem is that a lot of stuff gets developed and never gets integrated well enough that then it stays there. And this is what's creating what the problem that Kathy mentioned. If we don't integrate that code that has been developed, could be completely separate tools, could be a feature in an existing tool or an existing library, but if they don't get integrated, they're not maintained anymore after a few months by the author. The original author stops maintaining them because they publish their paper or they graduate. Most of them are students, and then the code is, bit rots.
Yeah, I agree. So we actually have a number of tools that we kind of selected as a supported platform, supported elements of the platform. Yeah. And whenever something changes, either in a library or in an environment, we're actually trying to fairly quickly to add this kind of patches to support those things. But as Davide mentioned, if something was not either merged or selected to be part of that group of the supported projects, then it becomes stale, and sometimes you don't even know because we never heard about this project, and somebody else using it, somebody started frustrating.
Pass it over to Jeff.
I think we might be sort of conflating our ambitions and the means to execute those ambitions. And so maybe to go back to your question just quickly, because I think we should come back to this, like how to execute. But one thing that it seems like we all agree on is some need for dealing with data-centric application development at a level of granularity that is above interest data exchange, whether that's in the form of APIs or library. There's many ways to talk about it. So that I would propose that's one area of violent agreement. One interesting area of disagreement, and I can disagree just for fun, is I think Kathy's comment about application developers don't need to know about names is a really sort of provocative and interesting way to think.
But I said unless maybe that particular application has a reason for it. So I'm trying not to put the applications in a straitjacket.
Right. No, and I just think it's interesting to actually go that far and say maybe some applications, it's reasonable to think they don't need to know about names, and what do the APIs look like if they don't know about names at all? For some developers, and I think it's a really interesting way to kind of go as far as we could with that idea. Seems like there's one more, and then maybe somebody else can try to summarize. But is this idea of greenfields versus the area where there's lots of activity and interest that's already happening and already out there? Because I think I agree completely that greenfields are an important area where NDN can add a lot of value, and the examples given already cover that. I also think there's a lot of value to target communities where there are kind of, again, only moderately good or fairly crappy solutions to networking. We were looking at peer-to-peer virtual environments, right? There's not great networking support. NDN could do well there, but it's not a greenfield. Like there's kind of a bunch of mess there. Or even in iOS, maybe we need some kind of way to, or at least some thread of exploration of why aren't we on the dominant mobile platform, at least for experimentation. Not dominant. Dominant in terms of mind share for a lot of developers in the US, in terms of revenue. Anyway, so those are a few other
So I want to violently agree with part of that, which is I think maybe what we should do is your phrase about the crappy middleware. Maybe in some cases we should look for things where there's crappy middleware and replace the crappy middleware with good NDN stuff, and I think that kind of fits into something that Davide said also about like having NDN 0MQ and.
So I want to talk, kind of agree and disagree about the naming stuff, and I don't even have an answer for this part. So, and that's also related to high-level stuff. So, kind of from one angle, you want to have very high-level APIs, so the applications developers don't care about names, don't care about anything, just develop magical application, everything is working. But then you start kind of going from the other direction and remembering that all security, everything is based on the name. And you actually need to visualize in some way, like I have no idea how, like all those data packets, all those keys, that the schema talk that I mentioned yesterday. So this has to be presented to the user in some way. This cannot be completely hidden inside the application, otherwise you may lose the properties of
So remember I said I'm not going to tell people, I'm going to show them, so you can go look at my code, and the thing that's really the application doesn't have to know the full name, but that needs to be in that enabling stuff in the bridge code, in the shims and the schemer. And
Of NDN, it was about the cross-layering, that you can look at what is happening at the lower layers. Maybe I misunderstood you, which somehow was going away from abstracting away from these things. So where are we all on the same wavelength that it is good to have high-level APIs, or is it exactly that we should be able to go and dive into what interface is used if need be? How opaque should the layering be? And I understood you were more in favor of exactly what ICN-WEN does cross-layering, optimizations, things like that.
yeah, I mean, I think it also has to do with how we define applications, back to the first thing. So I think that, we need to create a set. So from my point of view of measurement, I want somebody to be able to come along and write, a measurement client or a probe and not have to know a lot of details. So I'm trying to create this protocol so that if the way that they might think of the target that they want to measure is a different way, then it's being enabled in the middle. But again, maybe this is something that we disagree on, but I think that we expose as much as that application needs to know, and they may know a part of the name, and that's what they pass across the API, which gets assembled by this bridge code. And
there was that position of Davide saying, if you have to suffer, right, for solving all that details, how to optimally map on things, but then the world would look nice and clean on top of that. Is that really a model to work with?
That definitely would go a long way, and to complete like what Alex was saying, is like you need to expose the user to the security. Well, I mean, if the user doesn't want, or the developer doesn't want to bother with that, I mean, give him the defaults, which makes sense. And if you look right now at the simple producer consumer application out there on the NDN website, it doesn't have security, or it's not enabled. It doesn't have a schema file with even like commented out like lines, or like something that works and commented out lines. If you extend it to this, you can add the following rules, and so on. So you left with nothing. So I mean, offer some good defaults, and then like let the user like dig up if they need to. I mean, that isn't the same with the TCP/IP. I mean, you have like 10,000 socket options if you want to obtain like specific functionality. You don't expose all the socket options. I mean, it's like you have a socket and 3 methods or 2 methods.
But that's really a different kind of application.
Yeah, it's different. Obviously, it's different.
We started with. You said everything that somehow uses part of NDN, even low level, would be an application for you.
well, no, that's like, so what I said yesterday was that, we need a bridge that helps the application out, and those are the pieces that talk to each other. And actually, I think this ties into something Davide said, if I'm not misinterpreting it, that the pane should be in the library and so on. And I mean, this is a problem because we don't have good language, but I think what I'm talking about in the bridge is sort of libraries and frameworks, and I think that just ties into what Konstantin just said. And then there's something that uses those that doesn't need to know all of that stuff. And I'm calling that thing an application. But we clearly need to think about our language here. But so I don't know if I'm misrepresenting you or not. But.
This might be, this might sound a little wishy-washy, but I wanted to go to the, maybe Konstantin's point about the event-based model and sort of, not specifically Boost, but just generally the way of thinking in application development. And I think from Alex and I have talked about this a little bit, that there is sort of an NDN way of thinking, at least in terms of our team, that, you know, in terms of maybe the FIA team, in terms of what an application looks like, and thinking of it as this kind of asynchronous event-driven distributed system, even potentially in terms of the way an individual software component is written. And maybe there is a kind of cross-cutting issue here, which is we don't have a lot of discussions of that way and what it is and how it kind of propagates down from the conceptualization of an application or the movement of an existing application over NDN all the way down, you know, between these various layers of APIs. And so I wonder if that's a need, and I don't know necessarily how to fill it, or if it's a non-need and I'm making up something that doesn't exist. But I'm curious.
I brought it up, and I definitely know there is a need for such a thing. I mean,
I actually want to violently disagree with some of these elements. I wouldn't even use word NDN thinking with regard to asynchronous APIs. Basically, all development, like all high-level development, is asynchronous today. It may be done in a nicer way, in kind of faking the synchronous API. I'm even referring to the Unity framework. The Unity by itself is like completely event-based model. They have some cheaty way to kind of fake the kind of synchronous mode by you write this same sequence, but in reality it's asynchronous. All JavaScript is asynchronous. Okay, Python is in less that way. So we're going towards the concurrent, multi-threaded environment, and all applications they're no longer synchronous. And yes, it's a challenge to develop those applications. It may not be clear, but this is not the NDN problem.
Yeah, just one little clarification. I meant the intersection of other concepts like immutable named data with asynchronous design, not specifically just the asynchronous model.
Okay. Like we switched topics. I had some few comments about the security and high-level APIs. So one thing about security, you not always, or maybe almost impossible to have a default. Like if it's something default, it's probably not secure. Or if there's no automation, so security has to be based on some form of a trust. And this one, not always, or I don't want to give any specific statements about this one, but it's really hard to define secure default without some external assumption, external something. So that's why, I mean, we have a problem, like for sure. Like for the examples that we have, we definitely have to have a better schema that already embedded in that application, that you just specify some rules and it's creating a sign, doing verification. So we do have a problem, but it's harder to make a default. Another point, I just want to make a
quick
complete statement, yes. And then I'll shut down myself. So high-level APIs. So yes, it's really desirable to have APIs, like high-level APIs that I also put on my challenges. But it's also extremely important not to lose the sight of the kind of low-level stuff. And I can give you one example that we had during the development. So I think there was one application that could try to use the high-level, this is consumer producer APIs. So the application was developed, it was working fine, but then we realized, but from the application perspective, you share in the file, you receive in the file. And there was no literally way of saving the individual data packets that you received and put them in a cache so you can reuse at a later point of time. So if you don't have somehow, either through the library, some APIs internally to store that immutable application level framed data packets somewhere for the potential later reuse, then there's a problem. Again, this is just one specific example that we're facing with a very high level APIs that hit everything. But I would guess there would be other examples of this as well.
I wanted to come back to the catalog. Definitely we have not followed what I had envisaged the way, but it was a good discussion, not a problem. I want to come back to the application question, and my observation was that, if I'm not mistaken, everybody aimed high. You have here user-oriented functionality, but nobody started from information-centric, the network, where information flows and is processed. And this doesn't only happen at user-facing things. We have other information processing activities, being network management activities going on. So how do these applications fit into your picture? Is that also something that we should consider an application? I mean, this was the question at the beginning. What is for you an application?
Yeah, that's why I specifically excluded those as I call them utility tools or debugging tools. Those are in the same bin as the libraries, the lower level libraries, where the developers of those apps
but
can
the debugging
suffer.
tool is also user-facing. I mean, something really running independently.
Not end user facing, they're developer facing.
Yes. Yeah, right. A developer user.
But right, so the developers are the users of those applications, the application developers. So the application developers' life is made easier by those tools. But the developers of those tools that other developers use, they don't necessarily have to have an easy life. Well, of course, easy is better than hard, but I'm saying we should focus first on the top level of the stack. Whether the stack is the the end user stack or the developer facing stack. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Actually, that's maybe a good way to think about it. So like some of that stuff that I was saying is in the bridge, that's kind of developer-facing stuff, where the stuff that sits on top of it is more user-facing stuff. That might be a way to think about it.
But routing is not an application in this case. It is for you.
I do wonder if there's a third kind of practical category, which is neither developer or end user, but the people deploying and managing networks.
The
self-regulation. And sometimes they wear both. Yeah. They wear one or the other hats, but it's at least in practical cases, they're usually distinct.
Yeah. Okay, that was an observation about the where you have targeted the answers.
Christian, so I think these types of applications and whatever third or second type are important, but these are not the ones that bring NDN anywhere. So we can develop tons of TCP dumps, trace routes, and very nice network management, but they need it. Like I'm not excluding any of those. But this is not going to convince public that there's something need to be deployed just because we have very nice tools.
Sorry to intervene. You might have like users that might want to explore it, might want to give it a try. They give it a try, it doesn't work. The first time they try to do something, it doesn't work, and then they abandon, they go, like, we get a distributed database or like some other, like, whatever, middleware.
So I step in now. We have heard some recommendations from many of you. One I didn't hear is eat your own dog food. I have seen that in other projects, that it's really radical. I have seen a CEO blaming the CTO, if you send me an SMS instead of using our messaging system, I will not listen to it, even if it's important, whatever. And in front of everybody at hands-on, we there is no such a culture, right? All the meetings are not using NDN testbed on the voice channel. There is no Git replacement on NDN. All the tools would have to run over NDN on this, but it's not done.
So I forgot, that was actually a piece of clip art that I forgot on mine. But I think on my slide, one thing that I had as the first bullet in the convincing developers to use NDN was that it's not the internet of 20 years ago, right? And so the expectation of what tools need to deliver for developers and how easy it needs to be for them to use it means that we tried deploying NDN RTC as a way for people to communicate, and it's hard to deploy on many platforms. It's hard to debug if there's a problem, which are all very reasonable things for research software, I think, right? But to ask people to say, use these tools that are moderately supported and poorly documented and still to do real development tasks is really tricky. And I think when you couple that with...
So we're with the excuses now.
Yeah, so, okay, so no excuses. But somebody should fund the engineering of those things that are kind of have been studied, fund their engineering and deployment so they can be used. But
what would be a good candidate to start with the dog fooding, the eat your dog food? Would it be the distribution list of NFD or debug or ticket system? Or there must be one tool where you start and you stick to that and you eradicate all the problems. Otherwise, nobody will do it, right?
I mean, the sort of... Sorry, go ahead.
Beishan talked about it yesterday, and so basically the video, the recording of today's the conference would be distributed there. So,
but it's not critical if tomorrow nobody looks at it. It's not really critical for the next development.
Start slowly.
Yeah.
But what I add here, so this relates to the greenfield or not greenfield. If it's working today, if I'm reasonably happy to use whatever YouTube video, why would, what is my main motivation to even try that dog food, with exception just for the sake of trying the dog food? If we're talking about the new environment, I didn't do that at home, but for the home automation, I should try to use NDN in some places and play with that. If we have some nice AR application, I don't have any AR application on my phone. I would be willing to try out to deploy something at home, look in the lab and play with those things. So I would want to see something new. So those things we can do the dog fooding because they don't exist in real life.
Well, yeah, but I think we have to make them. And actually, I did use the dog food words in my paper that's coming out. But, and actually, that's something about the home thing. I mean, so Van and I have talked about, it's not that hard to go from DNMP to something for the home. So it's sort of an idea that we have of trying to do it in our house. I don't know if we'll get there or not. But I absolutely think that some of us should be trying to do it. I mean, we have too much, electronic garbage in our house, and doing videos and opening doors. And
and it would probably automatically force people to write the tools needed to debug it, to maintain it. So it would be a force that would exactly rally people around something that has to work, because otherwise all the others in the development team can't work.
So this is not an excuse, but there's no incentive structure to do that work. There's very little support, because generally the support around, at least in my understanding, around NDN and ICN right now is focused on networking research, experimentation, the kind of application research. It's not focused on tooling at the level needed to really get people to spend that time. So I agree with you, but there's very little incentive. Right?
I think there has to be more commercial interest, because if everything's done by universities, it's all based on publishing, and nobody's going to let you publish on tools anymore. Sadly, because I think some of this stuff can be elegant and interesting, and it's a contribution. Isn't that something grad students are supposed to do? And it prepares them for, making the world a better place and going to work somewhere else or doing a startup.
let that excuse slip through. Now, several of you have started. Somebody should. I try to now kind of wrap up a little bit before we invite the audience to ask, what would be your suggestion somebody should do what? What is your most important suggestion right now where you see we should rally around that activity? In which order do you want to make a suggestion? So, for example, Jeff said we need to discuss about how we execute. So somebody should get up and get more directive on what to do, or how did you mean that?
I'm not sure if I only get one, I'm not sure it would be that one. But
Okay.
I think, I don't have a somebody should in terms of execution, other than somebody should try to deploy it at some reasonable scale. So you mentioned in the ICN WEN case, the example of this Olympics case study, right, which is somebody needs to try something that's large scale, enough that we have a significant motivation to succeed and make the tooling and all those things work and drive the execution, because right now there's no incentive structure, industry or otherwise, to pull forward these types of things. I had a second, somebody should, which is somebody should describe, really give us, or we should collectively as a community write what a data-centric application is and what the principles are, and have a clear explanation of that and how it propagates all the way down. And maybe we have it already, and it's just repositioning it. But I'm thinking of the press release by the startup Alluvio today, which is content, media content fabric for CDN list distribution of video. And there's a clear description of what this is. It's very distinct from NDN and ICN, shares a lot of sort of principles though. And so where is our clear sort of statement of what is what is a data-centric vision for application?
Okay, thank you. And let's see, what is your suggestion?
So I liked your suggestion of dog fooding. It's hard to do, but I think it would be worthwhile. And I have an answer for Alex that seemed to disagree with this. If it becomes easy enough to use something, you shouldn't be able to tell the difference whether that tool is using NDN or IP. And then, who cares? I mean, we don't have to convince anybody. You can just sneak in the tool through the back door, and the next day they don't even realize. By they, I mean the users don't even realize they're using NDN. And that's how we achieve world domination.
Jeff already mentioned. Depending on what you define in the word tool, if you're talking about video conferencing application, it's not really a tool. And whatever we can develop would not compete with the commercial product.
I said it's hard.
I try now to cut it off a little bit. Alex, would you have a suggestion?
Okay, I'll phrase it in the way you put the first sentence. I already trying to sign up for the security improvement part. So I'll try to focus on these elements, so kind of the automate part, trying to do some form of visualization. So that's kind of suggestion for me.
So, yeah, I'll follow that up, because I was going to say in the sort of somebody should, and also maybe some parts that I would try to be involved with had to do with security. I have the advantage of seeing Van's versatile security toolkit, so I sort of disagree about the idea that you can't have security sort of templates or models, because he sort of has this idea that you can kind of put it together and then just put in your local trust anchor. And that might be the type of thing that could be really useful by a visual interface, that what you're now saying is, okay, I want to use this trust model in my house, and, type in your key and everything else will already be there for you. So I guess part of my role in that is getting it out there. But
Okay, so joining the security topic.
Yeah.
And from you?
I guess I'm the more modest one, like just a set of examples there, like simple to more complicated, and sort of like using pretty much or spanning various aspects of functionality, sync and streaming and chunking. Not complicated, simple, but
Writing the application guide was our dream for a couple last years.
that would go a very long way.
So I just read through the list, rally people around big projects that have high visibility, describe the data-centric mindset, the dogfooding, the automation on the security side, get the security obstacle out of the way without getting security out of the way.
I'm
a
actually
set
add
of
to that,
examples.
not just automating, like it's extremely important to do some form of visualizing.
Yeah, or that visualizing helping that, and more kind of cared or a curated set of examples. So with that, I would like to open the floor to the audience. What would you like to add on the somebody should do list?
Who? Okay. So I don't have anything in particular to add to the somebody should list. I just wanted to make some comments on the panel. I thought it was a really wonderful panel, and I think it's great that we're having something like this. As somebody who is repeatedly lost hope in NDN being a future internet architecture, I think that in particular just this NDN com has been very hope-inspiring, and mostly just because we've seen more panels from people from industry who basically just had a really simple story of we used NDN and it worked. If I'm honest, I'm just a stupid undergraduate, so a lot of the technical details in most of the presentations just went way over my head. But that Opera and Solar presentation was one that really sparked hope in me. And so that's somewhat related to what I want to say about this panel. One is that, so I mean, like, this is I promise I'm not saying this just because I'm an undergraduate, but I do find it ironic that even though a good chunk of the application development of NDN is done by undergraduates and graduate students, there is not one of them on this panel. And going further, it is also kind of ironic that for a panel about application development, a majority of the panelists here are like part of the NDN team. I feel like in reality, what it should be is most of the people sitting there should be ideally like people from industry, right? Because I mean, these are the people who would have desires for things they want to see improved in the NDN libraries. And so I think that, and so that kind of just like, sorry, let me look at my notes. And that just comes to what I mean, again, I'm just like a stupid undergraduate. I don't have a full understanding of this, but I do want to say this just to maybe provoke discussion anyway. I really like violently agree with one thing that Alex pointed out, which is that the reason, part of the reason for all these troubles is that we just don't have the manpower to do any of these things. I mean, like, it's obviously important that we have panels like this to discuss and point out what things need to be improved. But the missing piece, at least from what I've seen, is just that there's like 5 people on the NDN development team, and it's just not enough people to like make all of this stuff happen. I mean, like, just in my personal experience trying to use NDN RTC earlier this year, it was really difficult for me. I think it's largely attributable to the fact that I'm not a very good application developer, but it's also, I think, because there's literally just like one person who maintains NDN RTC, and that just made it, I mean, I just couldn't get the support I needed. And so I think that like the funny thing is that it's just, we just don't have enough developers is what I feel like it is. I mean, another thing that I violently agree with is what Kathleen was saying about like show, don't tell. I mean, like, in my experience as a person who just joined this project like 2 years ago or something, I've seen a lot of telling and very little showing. But again, that's why I've thought that this most recent NDN com was really hope-inspiring, because for the first time I feel like I did actually see some showing from people like Opera and Solar. So that's all that I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you for the observations.
Right, so just a quick one. I heard a lot about greenfield, which I think is okay for this community because we know NDN and we understand NDN. But it almost felt like for those people who are not willing to take that leap of faith, it's like we're saying, sorry, you're 2CIP users, we feel bad for you, but you're not going to help you. Is there something you're missing where we want to have, I don't know if this is such a term, but if there's such a term, but a gray field, something that enables people to kind of go from where they're at without having to go directly into a complete redesign?
I think Jeff had the word impure at some point.
Yeah, this one example. One quick example is to look at cloud-based messaging tools or frameworks and find ways that NDN provides interesting capabilities for those in LANs, because there are some nice extensions. I mean, so I think there are plenty of possibilities for that both answer a need and don't necessarily force people to give up on things that they're already using.
Okay, I want to follow up on Edward, that I have a complete agreement with him regarding the shortage of manpower. I think we need to given that there's an NSF people here, we really need to take a different look of what NDN is and what kind of funding model will be needed to pull off a new architecture. This is the later part. But I do have a violent disagreement with you as well. That is about who will be the people to develop applications over NDN. I hesitate to say that I graduated 30 years now, but I keep quoting Dave Clark, my former advisor, because he just has so many wisdoms. At one of the FIA meetings, I don't know if Darlene remembered that, I think he said something like, who is the people who actually build the applications on the new architecture? Those are not the existing app developers, because they got so used to how they develop applications yesterday. And therefore, due to the lack of understanding of the new power of the new architecture, it's really needed people who are in the networking system to actually develop the new generations of applications. I remembered now we all do conferencing on IP now, but the very first prototype was not done by any people who do audio video, but rather it was done by Van himself. He started with, I forgot what's the name for it, there's an audio tool or something.
Vic.
The Vic, there's
and
also
that.
audio. Right, yeah, that's it, right.
Yeah.
I don't know about the advanced audio. Like SIP is actually Steve's IP.
I'm just as old as you.
This all started in the early 90s when very few people even heard about the IP. It was before even web came along. There's a dark net. That's how the audio video over IP, the first thing got developed. So for that, I think it just to set in the history that really said the evidence is people who understand the new architecture know how to exploit its power. I have a few other things I want to mention. I hope if I take too long, let me know. About eating the dog food. In the early days of internet, we all ate our own dog food. You know why? Because everyone wanted to use email, and email is a dog food. You don't have to ask people to eat the dog food. They want it. Why it becomes so challenging for the NDN team to so-called eat their own dog food? Because today is different from back then. The internet is working. There's so many legacy systems, like the platform things Alex mentioned. Those existing networked systems are the great roadblocks to develop a new architecture. Back then, in 2010, when we signed up to do this future internet architecture development, the thought, look back, is so naive. We thought we just develop new protocols and we're done. But like Alex mentioned, that we don't know how much of our resources actually went into fighting with the legacy platforms, because they are really the obstacles. They run the computing devices, and that's what we want to implement the new protocols on. And all kind of roadblocks, restrictions, the lack of access to low-level networking devices that prevent us to do this information-centric implementation. Look at the talk earlier about how much effort went to say just enable the broadcast over 30 wireless should be broadcast to start with. But the IP left the manufacturer the impression the only thing they need to optimize is a point-to-point communication. That becomes a big roadblock for us to do information-centric. Those kind of things back in 2010, I had no clue that those big hidden roadblocks out there. So now, if I continue on about research funding, we got pushbacks from the NSF review panels to say, where's the new idea? You keep coming back asking for questions. I realized the one thing. We are competing for the same pile of money with those people who only produce papers. There's so many great ideas, published papers. Of course, some get used, but I think some may not. But the point is, for those people who publish SICOM papers, maybe there's a small part of that, they eventually go, I don't know whether they implemented, actually someone else picked up the idea, do the implementation. But for us to try out the new things, we have to build this thing. And I don't know if the funding actually has that part into it. I think this is one for the point Jeff has been arguing for a very long time. That is, the research funding doesn't really cover the part to do the development. Not to say that we have a huge development challenge to fight those hidden roadblocks of the existing legacy systems. I have the last point. I don't mean to make animals, the enemies, but about just take the on to say what the application should or should not know about security. I think that when we have the new architecture, we have to look at everything anew. I think I had this conversation or email exchange with Jeff before. Application developers, again, if you look today's pattern, of course they don't know application. So application doesn't know security. Security is ignored all the way down. It's only at the network transport level they patch the TLS on. And NDN has a security design in, and that needs to be reflected all the way up as well. So the application people need to know what their security policies. They don't deal with the key management, but they need to define the policy that has to be reflected in the application. I think in the DNMP, you may already have is somehow implicit or otherwise separately defined security model. So therefore, in your actual code, maybe it wasn't explicit. But I think generally speaking, the new application development must have this thing there, that is the application need to consider security, what their policies are. Of course, the execution is what we need to automate. So I think that it's not just that we do the same thing as we do today. I think there's a new thing that needs to be considered at every level. I'm done for that.
We continue with more observations, maybe.
Sure.
Well, I think we
Somebody
should
should-
briefly acknowledge that Jeff is a person who is eating the dog food, right? So,
I mean, we have, yeah, so I mean,
Yeah, so
we
I-
have run productions on top of NDN, so we have some sense of what's involved. I guess one quick comment on security, just,
Before we go to
Yeah.
like in the room, we have more people who are doing dog fooding. Like
Yeah, I mean, I
can
would say
acknowledge
that,
Jun
yeah.
Xiao,
sure.
who is doing a lot of experimenting with the NDN technology in various directions.
Just quickly on Lisa's point about security, I at least for us, I feel like it's really not a question of wanting to do the security in these applications. It's just the tooling in the sense that going through this 2-month exercise of building stuff on AWS with students and having to deal with role-based security, all the kind of AWS requirements for getting services to talk across accounts and things, that was highly influenced by what we've learned in terms of security in NDN, not data-centric, but just thinking about roles and the way that people access data. And the platform forces you to do it, so you do it. And the tooling gives you a bunch of templates, and you figure out how to use the templates. And so I do think there's maybe more willingness. It's actually just finding the right kind of tooling.
Christopher Foster, 26 Labs. So as someone over the last 2 years who's worked on the same problem that Konstantin's worked on, which is to use NDN, bake it into the Android operating system, all up and down the networking stack, be able to leverage existing applications that have no knowledge of NDN and be able to modify them to become NDN aware, build in all of the security mechanisms that both leverage what Alex's team has developed, as well as things that have been left as exercises for the readers, getting this system up and not necessarily deployed, but run at scale, a couple hundred people running multiple apps concurrently, sharing information in lossy environments, all of that. As we go to transition this to one or multiple entities, and we walk through all the conversations with people to get it accredited, what can people and organizations like my group do to help leverage our experience so that we can make sure that there are more people that are going to use this? And is it the tools that we are developing? Is it bringing in some of the members of the NDN consortium as we go and communicate with the government entities? I'm sure all of this is helpful for you, but what one thing should we be doing as we look to mature this NDN-enabled system?
So it's the question about how to interface with the maybe core community steering group, whatever.
I just don't have enough information. I mean, other than this is an open source project in this context. Is there a possibility of engaging with that open source effort?
Yeah, we can engage with the open source. The question, I guess, is more, we've spent a lot of time, some of these tools that you guys have asked for, the wish list, we've got our own homespun version of those. There's a bunch of crud that's been developed in these libraries you guys talked about, the half-baked ideas that never got totally implemented. We've stripped that out. Certain client libraries, members of my team think are garbage, so we've spun our own version of that. And then we've developed that very thick, very important abstraction layer between what application developers consider to be apps and what people like who are down and dealing with packets consider application. We built that up. Now that last part, very, very, very specific to whatever we're doing, probably nothing more than if we strip out all the stuff that could be sensitive, that's probably not going to be helpful beyond a generic example. I'm asking, is it us providing all this information back to the open source community, whatever we can get approval on? Is it going and getting some of you involved in some of the conversations so that this can become a standard? Those are some of the things that I'm looking to do, because to make sure that that this can take off. There are people who are interested in putting NDN on SpaceX vehicles and in 5G appliances and all the rest of that stuff. But what can we do based on all the time you guys have done to make sure that takes off?
Definitely, if you can put things in open source, great. But if you want to talk, I think, I suspect Randy's eyes are lighting up. Yeah, why don't you get, and I'm planning on doing some work with Randy, so, we would be really happy to get your email address, or maybe you want to post something on one of the NDN lists, and a few of us can have a side meeting or a side chat. So
the reason why I say that is because some of the back and forth when we've been doing, when we've put in merge requests for client library fixes and stuff like that, I understand you guys are focused on, quote, the hard problems and things like that. But all these other things.
By the way, it was the undergraduate I'm not part of, I've never been part of the FIA team or that team at all. So I'm not focused on that. But anyway, I would really like to get your contact information. And
my comment was more to Alex and Leisha and everyone else about what
But
the
I mean,
people who have been
with all
doing
respect, this is the first time that I've ever heard communication from anybody on the SHARE program about technical details. So it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And so if there was a merge request that we missed that was coming from you guys, I'm a little, I mean, I think this is, I guess, what I assumed would come out of SHARE at some point, which was the sort of scaling up of the ideas and experimentation. And so I think any way that your team or folks would like to engage in terms of code, or at least from my perspective, having kind of waited for this type of engagement, I mean, whatever we can do to, both in terms of the trajectory, but also the work that's already happened, would be great to talk about.
We'll talk offline then.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
yeah, Jeff and I are standing on our chairs, jumping up and down.
Given that Kathy recommended Orange get in contact, I just mentioned another company here, they haven't spoken up yet. It's also funded by the government, also doing mission critical development. I think they should contact you as well. They call the intelligent fusion technology somewhere here.
Yeah, so I think the trajectory was always there's industry interested, and the whole thing is open source. That's kind of what's, I think, as part of the DARPA share, there was objective to all code will be some form merged, like given open source, everybody benefiting from that part. And I agree with the other part that we also can get involved, kind of, if that would help.
Okay, I just have a couple.
Violently agree with that.
A couple points, and I'll get out of Ken's way because I'm sure we want to hear what he has to say. Have we put our finger on what went wrong with NDN RTC when we tried to use it so that we can learn from that? When we start to try and define what it means to be a data-centric network or a data-centric application, is it also part of that we define what are the classes of those applications? And for instance, there are sync applications that want to use sync, applications that want to be notified from sensors, applications that want to stream video, applications that want to do real-time bidirectional video, because those are all different classes that will use data-centric principles in different ways, and so they are probably completely different libraries.
So I think we should all go to lunch, but I'm not buying, sorry, can't buy. But I did want to just kind of acknowledge, and been trying to think about how to say something succinctly about this, but the issue of applications and building applications. I mean, so I'm the division director of the Computer and Network Systems division at NSF, and we funded the FIA program and the NDN project in several ways and others. And I'm also, as a researcher, interested in information-centric networking and NDN. But the systems community that we fund is really interested in building generic infrastructure for systems. And, you know, they want to abstract away the application's needs. And the reality is, this is the part that I just want to acknowledge, that if you send a proposal to build an application to NSF, it's not going to do very well, because that's the community that reviews, that we rely on for our reviews. And we've talked about this internally, and you know, that's all I'll say. We've talked about this, but it's hard. And I think about when the internet started, right? The DARPANET or ARPANET, there were 3 applications that everybody knew were going to be useful and were already useful when they first built that, and they could kind of try to work on those. And then 25 years ago, when people built applications, they built them on top of the sockets interface, right? Who is building applications on top of the socket interface today? I doubt if there's very many, right? And then somebody mentioned the manpower issue. I think about Cerner, which happens to be headquartered in my hometown, and I drive around Kansas City, and there's a building here, and there's a building there, and there's 10 buildings across the city because they have thousands of people building their electronic medical records applications. So it's a different world, and it's really hard. So what I would ask people to do is think about how should systems people, and I think some of this came out in the panel about where do we locate things and what's the right layer for things, and I'm sorry I had to miss part of it, but how do we think about the application needs and the sweet spot between one specific application and the trade-off between a class of applications and building everything for, customizing everything all the way down to the network layer. So if you have any thoughts about that, if you have any thoughts about how to encourage those kinds of research, please talk to Darlene or me. So, thanks.
Thank you. With that, I would like to conclude the panel. Let's thank the panelists. And from my side, sorry to not keeping fully in time. I didn't manage to quell completely the excuses. I didn't extract more somebody should do from the audience. But at least we have now 5, and I take that as a result of that panel. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for the attention.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Christian, and for the panelists.